Okay, so good morning, everyone. First of all, question for everyone, whether you can hear us. I hope you can hear us. If there is any problem, please use the whiteboard for writing what is wrong, but don't forget to include your name so that we know who is writing. So, good morning to everyone from Pavlo Jozef Šafárik University in Košice, from Faculty of Arts and Department of History. Let me welcome Professor Henrieta MORAVČÍKOVÁ from Bratislava. She's here with us. She will introduce the topic of her lecture to all of you. Here in the room with us are three early stage researchers that you know, all of you know, Jovana Vukčević, Anja Zuriš, Ondřej Jirasek, and another doctoral student from the Department of History, Patricia Fogilová, and we also have a colleague from the Department of History here, Dr. Fedorčák, and IT support, Marek Sekerak, and me. So let's keep our fingers crossed so that everything works, and we should begin now. As to the time schedule, I sent it to you some time ago, so the first part should end approximately 11:30 a.m. Okay. Your turn now.
Thank you for the introduction. Good morning, everybody. Today I would like to talk about a topic which is connected with modernity, with emancipation, with individual engagement in architecture and town planning, mostly about 20th century Europe, but as you will see in a near future, I start already with Enlightenment or with Renaissance things. To the terms you can see on the screen, I will come later. Let me start with a short trailer at the beginning.
Concurrently, while your first question may be the most pertinent, you may or may not realize it is also the most irrelevant. Why am I here? Your life is the sum of a remainder of an unbalanced equation inherent to the programming of the matrix. You are the eventuality of an anomaly which, despite my sincerest efforts, I have been unable to eliminate from what is otherwise a harmony of mathematical precision. While it remains a burden assiduously avoided, it is not unexpected and thus not beyond a measure of control. We just let you inexorably. Here. You haven't answered the question. Quite right. Interesting. That was quicker than the others. Others on that?
Okay. Let's come back to the presentation. Okay, sorry. And why it was presented, this kind of movie piece right in the beginning. The most important let's say, phrases and sentences which are somehow introducing our today's topic are marked red. So the architects, they always think that they can create word, entire word, or let's say improve the existing word. And of course there are always the individuals with their ambitions, with their personal life ideals or life ways that somehow interfere or even demolish the architect's idea. So this kind of contradiction or this paradox, I would stress that this always or was always present behind all these great stories of modern town planning or modernization of the society in the 20th century. So today I would like to talk about this paradox and mostly about the ambitions of engaged individuals that were trying to improve the world with their projects, with their initiatives. Why the term? Yeah. Sorry.
So we want to stop sharing. So this time is just a minute. Okay. Okay. It should be fine now. Okay. What is this?
Okay. So why the term or why the terminus engaged architecture? Actually, I was inspired by exhibition that was presented in 2012 in the Museum of Architecture in Germany, in München or in Frankfurt. That was done by the Professor who presented the idea that as it was, for example, the literature engagée or art engagée, so the same we can introduce for architecture, that equally as literature and as art, with their ambitions to influence the society in a way to improve the world, that the same could be somehow distinguished in the history of modern architecture, or let's say in the history of architecture and town planning in general. So this is something like a departure idea. For those who might be more interested in this topic, we can show the catalog that was published in connection with this exhibition. Okay. Another, let's say, idea for the beginning of this presentation or of my thoughts would be the criticism of modernity as with its ambition to change the world, and with its ambition to introduce a general project that would be implied worldwide and would lead to a improvement of the world conditions. In the middle of the 20th century, this kind of big legitimization story was strongly criticized, but there was not only one, but there were even several philosophers or theorists who argued against this criticism, and I choose one of them, the German philosopher and social theorist Jürgen Habermas, who in his famous text Modernity, the Unfinished Project, argued that the modernity is not finished because the potential of it, especially the potential in the means of utopian idea of the social impact, is still somehow live, and it could be still used in improving the social conditions. And one of his main arguments was that what we need, or what the society needs, is a kind of balance between the say, technocratic system of modernism and life word or a human system of modernity. So perhaps you can see few other let's say theoretical background that could be connected with this idea. We can go back to the Biennale of Architecture, to the first one, where the curator of the Biennale, Paolo Portoghesi, introduced all these let's say competing ideas. Some of them advocating the modern project, some of them criticizing them. The whole project was called The Presence of Past. And of course, nowadays when we are talking about present problems or present crises of town planning, we can feel or we can follow again the very same discussion as it was there in the, let's say, middle of the 20th century. So I would like to go back to the, let's say, beginning of all these ideas about engaged individuals, engaged architecture projects. And there is no other way than to start with Renaissance and to start with Thomas More, philosopher, politician, utopian thinker, who was actually the first one who introduced an idea of an ideal, not only an ideal society, but also with the ambition to introduce also the formal qualities of a settlement connected with this society. And actually his ideas, as you can see on the screen, were based on of course, first of all, removal of the private property, which was very important when you want to divide the land and when you want to use the land, and of course with the strong reformation of the family, of the understanding of family, which was put from individual self more to a kind of community or communal life. Why it is important to go back in such an ancient history? Because these ideas we can find in a modified version, actually, in all of the projects that have been developed in later 18th, 19th century, or even in the 20th century. As you can see on the previous image and now as well, Moore was talking about an island with a capital and settlements which should be equal in size and number of inhabitants. Very strict organization of the society and of the country, of the landscape as well. And what is perhaps interesting, the idea of how we thinking about the sharing of homes, sharing of households, that people will move from one household to another one in this interval of 10 years, which is really a kind of very communal, very socialist idea. Of course, this was only utopian or not realized, his ideas. Nevertheless, in the minds of people, it remains as a reference point also for other thinkers who came later after Thomas More. When we jump over a few centuries, we can have a look on the situation in France. Thinkers connected with social reform, with state reform, and of course with reform of architecture, and let's say about reforming town planning, even if this term of town planning was not introduced at that time. So we can for example talk about Claude Nicolas Ledoux and his idea of ideal town, which remained not only as a utopia but was partly realized in this Royal Salt Mines in Shaw, where you can actually experience, unfortunately or fortunately, only the formal environment and not the social order. But when we look at this idea of how to organize the settlement in an ideal way, it was nearly all of the authors in this period, they were thinking about quite concentrated settlements with a core, which was a kind of public space with most of the administration and culture gathered there, and around this let's say public center, there have been the private or the communal houses intended for living and places intended for work. So very concentrated and organized in a kind of community. When we look at the other representatives of utopian socialist ideas in France, as was André Gaudin and Charles Fourier and others, you can see that the idea of this concentrated radial and center-oriented system is always present. Here you can see the city of the social order, which was actually organized in it was a kind of combination of these small community palaces called phalanx. Let's have a look at on such a phalanx. What is perhaps interesting to mention that all these thinkers been thinking about these new space organizations still in the limits of the, let's say, the debate, the architecture debate of that time. So you can see traditional forms of let's say, bourgeois society that was switched to be used by working classes. So no new architecture or urban forms, but the very traditional one. And we will see also during the 20th century that this idea of using very traditional palace form with the internal court, which was intended to be a kind of communal space, will bear again and again by particular different thinkers. So this community house, or one of the first idea of house commune, was based on this palace layout, was intended for, as you can see, something approximately like 1,500 of working people who would share their social equipment and cooking and I don't know, like for example, caring about their children together. Here is one of the realized examples of such a workers' palace with a communal kindergarten in the ground floor and separate living spaces for the families on the upper floors. It is perhaps good to underline also the way how the inner space is organized. These galleries will be present during the whole 20th century as an important architectural feature connected with social housing, with housing for workers, with housing with the ambition to be communal or intended to somehow support the community life. Perhaps now it was more oriented, or I spoke more about the architectural features, but it is important to say that these For example, the layouts of these worker palaces, of course, influenced the way how the town was organized. That it was organized in a kind of symmetrical matrix or symmetrical structure. Again, due to the goals or due the inspirations taken from the high society organization of let's say palaces and the seats of governors or of bourgeois. Another idea which is strongly influenced by the idea of engagement, of personal engagement to improve the situation in the society and to invent, let's say, new way of organization of the physical environment was the idea of garden city. The most, let's say, influential and the very first representative of this idea was the English thinker and the town planner Ebenezer Howard. And it was very similar with his, let's say, with the background of his idea, as we have already seen by Thomas More, that the land reform, that the common use of land and removing of the private property was actually the background of each of these ambitions. So it was the same with Ebenezer Howard. The first step in his revolutionary thinking about new town and new society and new organization of the landscape was removal of the private property, kind of land reform, which would enable the town planners and the architects and the urbanists to organize the country in that way that all the society could use the resources in a balanced way, in a way that will enable them all to live in a healthy environment and healthy cities. Another thinker, when we talk about Ebenezer Howard, he was more concentrated on putting small settlements, as you can see on the previous example, to arrange smaller settlements in the country surrounded by the agriculture, cultivated land, which will be a source of living resources for the people. The idea of Tony Garnier was to organize industrial city in a way that it will be comfortable or healthy, not only for the representatives of the capital, but also for the representatives of the working class, or for the working class. So he invented a kind of idea of ideal industrial town. As you can see, therefore, 35,000 of inhabitants that would be divided in the manner of already existing principles of modern town planning. It means dividing industry, dividing the administration, dividing the recreation, and dividing the residential areas from each other to make the city more hygienic and more suitable for a human life. You can see here, for example, he have chosen a concrete or a particular locality where he situated his ideal project of a town, which was organized in a sense of prevailing winds, the natural conditions of the town, and the orientation towards the north and south, So you can see that the industry was situated away from the residential zones or from the public spaces, but connected with, for example, with schooling, with education, and of course connected with the traffic, which was an important tool for distribution of the resources, etc. So all the ideas that actually was being or originated in the late 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. For example, in the German town planning or urban discourse, been implied in this idea of ideal industrial city. And what is perhaps interesting from the point of view of organization of the town is that he introduced very non-hierarchical structure with features that were somehow connected with ideas of the garden city of Ebenezer Howard, but in the same time with a very focus on the industry, because at that time industry was for this kind of engine for developing or for origin of the new cities. Here are some images of how he was thinking about the organization of the residential quarters. Again, this idea of garden city, non-hierarchical structure, already with the idea of dividing the main traffic away from the residential areas. When we talk about the ideas of modernism and about the ideas of modern way of changing the society and changing the living environment, we cannot escape from the ideas that originated in the Soviet Russia, which been connected with Marxism and with left-oriented ideologies, with the Soviet avant-garde. Here you can see some images of the publications devoted to the organization of new society, of new settlements, of new ways of dwelling that have been elaborated or published in the 1920s and Soviet Russia. The most interesting from our point of view of influencing the organization of the physical world, I consider two. One is the house commune, and the other one is the idea of a linear city that was called Sotsgorod in the Soviet society. Both of these ideas are connected with the general social reform. The linear city, and somehow in the same way as it was already introduced by Tony Garnier, the main goal was to organize the new industrial settlements, the industrial cities, in a way that would be rational, that would be hygienic, and that would be sustainable for future development. So here you can see one of the first projects for the linear city. Magnitogorsk was a town in Siberia, and things that were later used or introduced in the frame of the Charter of Athens, you can see here as already very, very concrete proposal for building a new town. Of course, the main line or main idea for the city was the railway line or the traffic line. According to it, all the industry was organized, and the industrial zone, of course, divided by the green zone from the residential areas that have been again connected with a kind of recreational areas, areas connected with a kind of interesting land settings, and of course connected with agriculture. Very similar in also other cases. As you can see, no high-rise, the land was used with the idea that there is plenty of land that you can really develop the city unfinished near or linearly or parallel to the railway through the country. Of course, it is understandable because when we think about Siberia, which is really unending land, so these ideas sound quite reasonable, perhaps not that reasonable in a condition of Central Europe or Western Europe, where of course the land situation was completely different. Nevertheless, these ideas influenced very much not only the Soviet conditions, but also the Western or Central European architecture discussion in the 1930s, as we will see on our next examples. Another idea connected with the social reform, with the new socialist society of the communist Russia or communist Soviet Union, was the idea of house commune, which was a residential building organized in small living cells and shared social equipment like kitchen, dining room, kindergartens, cultural and let's say sport facilities. It was of course connected with the idea of communal life, the idea of woman emancipation, because women shouldn't be somehow connected with kitchen and with homework. So all these homeworks were actually intended to be outsourced and to be done by state companies and not by the individuals themselves. This is one of the very, I would say, most interesting examples designed by Moise Ginsburg, who was one of the most influential architects of the Russian avant-garde, and Narkomfin was Narodny Komitet Financí. It was something like Ministry of Finances in Soviet Russia, and this should be a accommodation or residential block for the people working for the ministry. This project was also realized and inhabited like a, let's say, social experiment, and used as a example, as an inspiration for many architects around Europe. Here you can see the layout. I hope you can see that it's not too small. As I already mentioned, very small, minimal cells for living. Then the common spaces for cooking and for dining, and also culture, as I already mentioned, the raising of the children, etc., etc. All the building was organized as a kind of social factory, as a machine in the frame of which the family life of the employees of the ministry was organized. Very similarly as in the Soviet environment, these ideas have been developed in let's say, Western European architecture discussion in frame of the Congress of Modern Architecture. SIAM, already the second meeting of SIAM in Frankfurt was organized under the title of looking for the flat or the dwelling of existence minimum, and house commune was one of the examples how the lack of flats in Europe could be solved, but not only the house commune, but also the several other proposals of the dwelling for existence minimum. And the second one, or the third meeting of the SIAM in Brussels tried to not only organize a particular building or a particular residential building, but also the environment in the town, how the new town could be organized in a way that the flat like it could be solved. Of course, the ideas, as I already introduced them in the Soviet environment, so the linear city, the development of row houses and existence and residential buildings with minimal flats being introduced in these congresses and published in a frame of the catalogs that were connected with these meetings of modern architects and town planners. Perhaps it would be nice to underline that now we have a tendency to understand these movements as something massive or something general, which is not that case. It was not the case at that time. It was really very personal engagement of few architects, town planning, thinkers who been active in frame of the Congress of Modern Architects. It was not the way of massive architectural society movement as it might be understood from our today's position. So it was very brave from the people of that time, very individual, very personal to try to solve the problems of the society of that time. Why I'm stressing it? Because these architects actually many times risk their own, let's say, jobs or personal careers in engaging themselves in this left-oriented social agenda. This was also the case of the situation in former Czechoslovakia. I would like to show you now some examples from the Czech and Slovak environment in the 1920s and 1930s, because I think, and generally I would say it might be said that the development and the thinking in the way of engaged architecture in our country was very influential for the general international debate. Of course, the most important representatives being the architects united or concentrated in the group of Leva Fronta, left front in Prague, but not only them, because they are quite, how to say, well known as thinkers and as representatives of the modern movement architecture. But there are some others that should be mentioned. So I would like to start with Jiří Kroha, who was an architect from Brno, very much engaged in this social program. He was one of those who did a kind of research on social conditions in former Czechoslovakia. He analyzed the living conditions of the worker class and make a kind of comparative study that he called sociological fragment of housing, and he compared the living conditions of the working class with the living conditions of the bourgeois. And this was his point of departure when he then later designed ambitioned social-oriented housing projects. I would like to stress his position as a member of avant-garde, of left avant-garde in the 1930s, because we will see how he continued in developing these ideas also after the Second World War, and how his, let's say, language of expression changed. In 1930s, he was really a kind of let me say, functionalist architect or town planner, and after the Second World War, it switched a little bit to a different position, perhaps in a way how it was said in the very beginning, more traditional, more looking back to inspirations in historical architecture. But let's go to another influential person, another influential thinker that is perhaps not that well known in an international environment. Friedrich Weinwurm was an architect based in Bratislava. He studied in Berlin and Dresden, and actually made his main career in former Czechoslovakia, and he was very much involved in social housing and in advertising the idea of minimal flat, advertising the idea of house commune in Czechoslovak architectural discussion. You will always see a kind of his statements or quotation from his texts, because he was one of those architects who was not only designing architecture or realizing buildings, but also writing theoretical statements or manifestos, let's say, on social housing especially. What is also perhaps interesting to mention are these, what you see on the image. These are covers of avant-garde journal called Nova Bratislava, or New Bratislava, Die Neue Bratislava, three-lingual avant-garde journal dedicated to social conditions of working class in 1920s or in 1930s in Czechoslovakia. Why I'm mentioning this? Because always the local discussion was somehow connected not only with architecture but with the political background, with the social discussion, and of course with the intellectual discussion, and each other support somehow, or they were supporting each other somehow, and the publication of journals, of special monographs devoted to this problem was very important tool of that time to introduce the idea of social housing, of personal engagement in the society. I would like to go back to the situation in former Czechoslovakia, because I would say that it was with a few other European examples, very exemplary in the way how the engaged architects really could influence the society, could influence the built environment. Czechoslovakia was one of the examples. Then I will go back to Germany and to Austria. But it was like this: the background or the frame for these activities was also legislation with a new law which support financially and financial state support of social housing or the minimum flat. This was not the case in all of, let's say, European countries. It was quite exceptional and very influential in for the engaged architects when they introduce their projects to the society. This is only some to introduce the architect Friedrich Weinborn more deeply, because he was really a figure that started to work on the idea of social housing very early, already in 1920s, which was not always the case in, for example, especially not in Slovak society. But in general, Czechoslovakia, after this new legislation, was a very good environment, very welcoming place for realization of this social engaged thinking. You can see here several projects that originate exactly after the legislation was approved by the new legislation was approved by the government. Early 1930, already in each of the town in the country, some new social housing projects rose. Some of them like direct commissions. Some of them like big architecture or town planning competitions, especially those two where you can see here on the bottom of the image in Prague, where as I already mentioned, the Leva Fronta, the left group of left-oriented architects was very active. They organized these two town planning competitions with the background of Social Democratic Party or Communist Party. Both of them, unfortunately, remain only as a project, not realized in built environment. In Bratislava, the case was completely different because of several social circumstances. All these efforts could be developed from the avant-garde projects to the reality. Here on the image you can see one of the very first projects realized in Bratislava, the first social housing project, which was intended as a communal housing in following the ideas of House of Commune or communal house of Soviet avant-garde. You can see the argumentation here behind this project. This is the part of the text written by this gentleman, František Vaverka. He was actually the initiator of the project, member of the Social Democratic Party, very influential person in the town environment, and he engaged directly with the direct commission the Friedrich Weinborn, architect, who was already well known for his social-oriented ideas and for his projects of minimum flat. These are first sketches or the first ideas how the small social housing estate should look like. it was quite revolutionary when you think about a traditional town which was organized in blocks and the streets and squares, and this was the first project which introduced the organization of the houses in separate rows, divided by the greenery, with all these implementation of all these ideas of hygiene and insulation and fresh air and orientation towards the sun, towards south and north, etc. When I was talking sooner about the idea of the working palace, and you have seen the residential building organized with galleries. So again, the idea of galleries was considered to be the best solution for the social housing because of the possibility to support somehow the community or the communal life on these galleries, very similar as you have seen in these projects of the Russian house commune, small apartments organized in a kind of cell way on these galleries, and not only organized in a similar way, but also equipped in a similar way. You can see that the interior was more thought as a living space without dividing the particular functions in separate rooms like bedroom or kitchen, etc. So kitchen was a kind of niche in frame of the living cell, which is very, at that time it was very, let's say, revolutionary idea in traditional environment, where the idea of a bourgeois flat with a bedroom, salon, living room, and of course kitchen was still very, very present in the minds of people. Another important thing was also the idea that everybody should have the same, not only the same flat of minimum square meters, but also the flat should be furnished with the very same furniture that would be somehow given from the cooperative who owned all the buildings to the inhabitants. Unfortunately, the idea with the furniture was not realized because of the lack of money, but all the other ideas introduced by the architect became reality. And what is also important to say that this engaged thinking, social thinking, which was connected with organization of flat, organization of living environment, organization of city and or the housing settlements, was also always connected with very ambitious thinking in a direction of technologies, direction of construction, direction of use of materials, because architects of that time thought that typification, unification, and all these, let's say, modern tools in the organization, the building industry, will help to improve the social conditions finally. So this was why the architect insisted on building the social housing estate in reinforced concrete skeleton, because it enabled to build very quick, to build quite cheap, and to build with the possibility to have the more free space, or more to be more free in organizing the layout of the building. This let's say revolutionary project was taken by the the society, I would say, in two different ways. Of course, the people connected with the left avant-garde perceived it as a very important, as you can see from this quotation, a very important step towards a revolution in a housing revolution in a society. But from the more conservative circles, it was taken like well, this is a kind of experiment, and we will see what will happen. And because of this, let's say, more traditional thinking, it was even not realized in its very radical form. That finally, after the construction, the idea of house commune was they skipped the idea, and it was the dwelling from the very beginning served as a normal flats for families, even if there have been these common facilities in the parterre of the building, like facilities for dining, for culture, like a common library, even if there have been the space for growing their own common fruits or vegetables in the yards. There should have been something like nowadays so fashionable community gardens. So this idea was left from the very beginning, because there was, as the local critics of that time wrote, the society was not courageous enough to carry out these revolutionary ideas to the end. Nevertheless, it was very how to say, encouraging for the other people, especially in Bratislava, because Bratislava at that time was quite left-oriented, when we can put it like this, because of many representatives of social democracy and Communist Party in the municipality. So it was very inspiring for them to develop or to think about other similar projects. This was what you can see on the screen, is a publication, also very typical for that time, engaged thinkers, that it was always, each project was always connected with a kind of publication that summarized the ideas and the way how the project was developed, and what was actually the mission of the project. So the humanistic, the engaged and the, let's say, utopian idea of the project was introduced by the people who've been engaged in the project in this book. Of course, all the Czechoslovak architecture is seen, understood it as a important milestone. It was published everywhere. Also, Karel Tajger, who was the main thinker, main personality behind the Leva Fronta, left-oriented architects in Prague, mentioned this project with respect in his monograph on the minimum flat. After having such a great, let's say, impact in society, it encouraged the local engaged intellectuals to start a new project with the same architect, with even more ambitious name. After Unitas came a new age, new age housing estate, again social housing, improving the ideas that have been already introduced in the first project. Same architect, nearly the same intellectuals or politicians, local politicians being behind this. As you can see, a little bit the special organization of the housing estate changed, but the main principle to organize the apartment houses in the rows remained. But after the discussion connected with the first projects, they decided to make it not that open, but to organize it in, let's say, half closed yards, because to support even more the feeling of the community inside of the yard. Again, the ambition to improve the technical or the construction solution. So after they tested the idea of reinforced concrete skeleton on the Unitas project, they switched to even more ambitious steel construction of steel skeleton, which was at that time cheaper, easier to construct, and of course much more quicker in construction, because they used only very few typified elements to construct the whole apartment building. As you can see there, they've been very proud of the methods they chose for the construction. The project from the very beginning was very much followed by the public and very successful. They started with the first group or first apartment block, but already when it was under construction, they put another one and even another one. So finally, 3 of these apartment blocks have been constructed. What is important from the point of view of engaged architecture, engaged town planning, is that from the very beginning it was thought as a kind of new city quarter, not only like with dwelling and this community space in frame of the courtyard, but also with the public spaces devoted to sport activities, to children. There should have been public parks, public swimming pool, like recreational facility for those housing blocks. What is interesting that actually, even if the project took till the final realization nearly 10 years, all these public facilities have been realized as it was intended in the first project, except of the public swimming pool. Unfortunately, this project was not given that much attention by the discussion or the international architecture discussion. There are several reasons for that, because the first stage was finished 1932, but the second only 1936, and the third one only during the Second World War. So the architectural discussion at that time in Germany or in Austria was actually not more oriented on this social avant-garde things, because of the Nazi politics that actually in the second half of the 30s took over in Germany and actually vanished all the left-oriented discussion. why it was possible in Bratislava, it is perhaps interesting to argue that Bratislava was not really a kind of metropolis at that time. It was not an important center. It was second or even perhaps third town in former Czechoslovakia after Prague and Brno, but it was a town with a very revolutionary potential, because after the end of, or after the origin of Czechoslovak Republic, most of the former Hungarian and Austrian or German intellectuals or the elites left the town, and the new elites from Prague and from the Slovak regions came into the town. New elites with completely different ambitions than the traditional ones, and their ambition was quite visible, that they were trying to develop a very new town with a new image, not looking back to the history of Bratislava. And this was somehow destructive, but on the other hand, it was somehow helpful for the engaged thinkers, especially in a means of architecture and town planning, because the opposition towards these new ideas of modern architecture, of functional or industrial city or social housing was not that big, or even perhaps there was no one. So what could not have been realized in Prague because of the opposition of the traditional society, it was quite easy possible in Bratislava, which was very much future-oriented and very much modern in public thinking in general. As I already mentioned, I would like to touch two other European situations of that time, where the ideas of engaged architecture been implemented in a similarly intense way as in Bratislava, in some of them in the same form, when we're speaking about architecture and town planning, and in one of them in a completely different form. When we look at the Berlin of 1920s and 1930s, we can face a kind of metropolis with a very big problem of housing shortage and a very intense new idea about cooperative construction of housing. So something same as in Bratislava, but in much bigger scale. When you look at the numbers, 6 housing estates with really 140 dozens of new built dwellings, which is really an enormous number. The people who've been behind it, like Bruno Taut, Martin Wagner, Walter Gropius, Hans Scharoun, again the most important representatives of the left-oriented avant-garde, only perhaps like to stress the connection between the European architects of that time, which might be also interesting for this project, or the perspective of this project is that Martin Wagner, really the eminent gris, I would say, behind the whole project of the cooperative housing in Berlin, was a schoolmate of Friedrich Weinborn. They studied together in Berlin. So you see that the ideas about the social housing and about the engagement of architects in changing the living conditions of the working class being shared by the European architects, let's say of the same generation in all of the countries, or nearly all of the countries. I will just, as an example, show one of the most important projects done by Bruno Taut, which is the Hufeisensiedlung in Berlin. I choose the one because it's quite similar in some way in the ideas with the ideas of Friedrich Weinhorn introduced in the Unitas housing estate. You can see the nearly not the same but similar figure in the center of the Siedlung, of the estate, organized with a common public space, similarly like it was the case of the Unitas housing estate. These are social housing with minimal flats that spread then to a kind of, let's say, garden city, starting with the first radials are somehow still apartment houses, but then going into the semi-detached family houses. So much more ambitious project, much bigger than it was in Bratislava, but from the formal point of view, the core of the idea was very similar. As you can see, both of the examples were have been designed in the way of modern architecture, thinking what could be called Neue Sachlichkeit or functionalism, whatever you'd like to call it. Again, as it was the case in Bratislava, the connection with politic parties, again, Social Democratic Party, very similar as in Bratislava, also in Berlin, which the Social Democratic Party directly supported the social housing program. So from the very beginning, the engaged architects somehow couldn't escape the alliance with the politicians, and especially with the left-oriented politicians. Here's some images how the Hufeisensiedlung is still working now. It's under protection, very important part of architecture heritage of Berlin, recently renovated in the way to come near to the former color solutions of Bruno Taut, who was quite well known for his expressive coloring of the houses. These are the semi-detached family houses, as I mentioned, and this is the part of the center of the housing estate with the communal space, public park, and recreation facilities, and some public facilities now there is a museum and exhibition of the project situated there. Another important center of implementation of the idea of engaged architecture could be considered, or should be considered, Frankfurt am Main, another German city which was where the social housing was organized in a similar way as in Berlin, as a cooperative project. As I mentioned in connection with Bratislava, that there is also always the idea to publish the thinking behind the project in a kind of manuscript or in kind of periodical. It was the same in Frankfurt, very famous, let's say, avant-garde periodical, as Neue Frankfurt, the New Frankfurt, where you can find not only the projects of the particular the residential buildings, but also the ideas behind it. And also very important thing, as we have already touched, the idea of emancipation, not only emancipation of individual or human being, but the women emancipation, and exactly with the Frankfurt cooperative social housing was connected the idea of a new rational small kitchen for emancipated women, designed by the Austrian architect Margaret Schütte-Lihotzky, a very important woman architect, one of the first influential European women architects. She, after being engaged in the architecture office in Frankfurt, she left for Soviet Russia, where she was taking part on designing for new towns and new housing estates and for the communist Russian developments. Really very interesting woman. She stated later that she never cooked at home, so the idea of Frankfurt, the Frankfurt kitchen was really a kind of academic project. Nevertheless, I would say that all of the kitchens after 1926, of the modern kitchens, they are following the same way of organization of the cooking space. Some of the images of how the again protected Frankfurt new housings are looking now. And finally, in this first part, I would like to go to example which with the same intellectual, ideological, philosophical background, but with completely different architectural forms. Red Vienna, again the project of social cooperative housing supported by Social Democratic Party of Vienna, which somehow reminds the projects of the social utopian architects and thinkers that we have seen in the beginning of our session, more reminding the historical surroundings like ballet compositions with closed yards devoted to the activities of the community, using formal language which is somehow inspired by the historical architecture and actually even advertised as a palaces for working class. So we will see that after the Second World War, this idea of more traditional, more history-inspired way of looking at modern dwelling was quite widespread. But Vienna started with this way of thinking about the social housing already in 1920s. Only how the again protected national heritage of Austria, the very famous Karl Marx Hof. Look at the name, Karl Marx Hof. It's like very visible where the inspiring ideas for this project came from. So nothing happened. So I will not. I think we are already a little bit out of time. So I'm sorry. We will continue after the lunch break.
But first there is
something.
Questions?
So, okay. So I have a little bit.
We will get back to the session now. So thank you thanks our guest lecturer for the first part of her captivating presentation. And now I would like to give the floor to you, to early stage researchers or to representatives of partner organizations. So we decided before that we would use the whiteboard just for the order of questions, but I would maybe start with our early stage researchers who are here to maybe ask something or contribute. So please. Yeah, Alice, yeah, you have to come here so that the rest can hear you.
I just have a question about how the project was financed and who paid for it, if it was industries or promoters like today or states for these communal buildings.
Yeah, it was not the same for all of the projects, but I would say that this was kind of a joint investment, partly city or the municipality. Partly it was kind of raised money organized by the political representatives, and partly also investment of the individuals who actually became the flat in the. This was the idea of the cooperative. That you invest small money and then you get the support from the state and from the municipality. So it was very good functioning, for example, in Slovakia, because here there is a very strong and very long tradition of cooperative thinking in general. It was used in agriculture and everywhere. So, or in handicrafts, like to support the individual craftsmen or the farmers, and they used the very same model also for the financing of the social housing, let's say. But some of the projects been really only the investment on the city, and for example, Vienna was really like a municipality project.
Okay. So it was supported also by the party that way.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. I'm getting back here. So anybody else, please? You can turn on your microphone and just ask, because no one has written anything on the whiteboard. So, yeah.
I would like to ask a question.
Okay, it's Susanna.
Yes.
Okay, it's our early stage researcher, Susanna Vedige from BTH Karlskrona from Sweden.
Hello.
Yeah.
I was reacting to the linear study you talked about in Magdeburg, and I know the term from Spain from 1882 when it was coined by Antonio Soria y Mata. So I have two questions. The first one is, how do you see the question of this term linear city? About since the concept came from Spain. My question is about the traveling of knowledge. How did this term came to Russia, and how did they use it? Because it did not mention Spain at all, so I was just wondering about that. And the second question is about knowledge exchange between East and West. There was a lot I know, but can you tell a little bit more about that?
Okay, thank you. Okay, for the linear city, yes, they are, of course, the idea in Europe originated in Spain, but I'm quite sure that the Russian architects, they have not used the connection with the Spanish, let's say, first idea of the linear town. I don't know if it was intentionally, because that was quite typical for the architects of avant-garde, that they have not referred to the history, because they would like to stress that they start from the very new and they are much more future-oriented, so not referring to the previous examples in that way that they have been inspired. But it could be quite possible that they have known about the project or about the idea, because all of them have been educated in a traditional way, so I thought that they have had a general knowledge about the history of architecture, because this is also interesting to say that most or all of the architects that have been so influential in 20s and 30s, that they have had a very traditional academic background, so the education was very traditional, not modern one, which they have been practicing when they have been teachers. So I would say the knowledge of the history was there, but it was intentionally not referred to. And the second question, I think that the exchange of the knowledge was very, very selective. That some of the groups of the architects, they really, how to say, they developed relations, they exchanged literature, they visited each other, as was the case for for some left-oriented architects traveling to Soviet Russia, traveling to Moscow to go to work there, as it was the case of Hannes Meyer, the second director of Bauhaus, who after he was put away from his position, he went to Russia and worked there in Moscow. Or many others, as I mentioned, Grete Schütte-Lihotzky, who personally went to Russia and worked there. Regarding the let's say, written knowledge, I don't think that it was that intense because, for example, all the texts in Russia have been written in Azbuka, so it was not so easy to be read for Western architects or for Slovak architects or Czech architects as well. But these architects, they took part in the Congress of Modern Architecture, so they met there in Brussels, in Frankfurt, and could exchange the knowledge. For example, the magazines of that time in Western Europe or in Central Europe, they published translations of the texts of Russian architects or the Russian left-oriented architects. It was like, but as I already said in the beginning, it was very selective because it was always what the individual editor was interested in. So this was what he translated, or this was the author whom he invited to publish in his periodical. For example, the architect I talk about, Friedrich Wandler, the Slovak one, he visited Russia as well. He gave lecture on Red Russia after his visit, but we have no idea what he actually said because there is no written like publication or nothing from this. So that could have been many of such journeys and of such reports, but without any let's say serious historical document that could serve as an improvement of it. So it's I would say this is a kind of interesting topic to be researched much more.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question.
Okay, this is Elvira Carolina, a real estate researcher from Universidad Valladolid in Spain.
Hello, thank you for your first part. It was interesting. So I have some questions. First, it's also related with a linear city model. Regarding the Soria Mata concept, I just wanted to mention that Soria Mata concept was for individual dwelling. So actually it wasn't a city concept. It was a settlement, industrial settlement. And in the concept of Milutin, it was really a city. Just wanted to ask, do you agree that Milutin's idea was the first idea of industrial city or such kind of model, which appeared in the Soviet Union? Or can you relate, for example, his ideas with Tony Gardner's ideas? Or do you think that it was the first thinker in this direction? The second question, how you evaluate the influence of party on these modernist ideas, their participation and the engagement in these projects? And maybe finally will be the question, do you see some similarities between this modernism direction in different cities? You mentioned Germany, Soviet Union, and the Czechoslovak Republic. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for these many questions. Okay, well, I hope I have not lost one. The first one was regarding the linear city. Yes, you are perfectly right that the Spanish example was on individual dwelling, but in some way it is always put in connection because you cannot avoid this kind of formal relationship. Tony Garnier and Sotgorod, of course, these ideas are very, very similar. The only, I would say, which is the difference between them is that Sotgorod was really strictly organized in lines, like parallel lines, and Tony Garnier put his idea of ideal industrial city more like in relation with the topography of the place. So it was not that, well, how to say this, that rigid from like a technocratic perhaps. That he was more thinking about the real conditions, natural conditions of the country, and Milutin was more thinking about the ideal system that could be implied everywhere. So I would say Milutin was more scientific, more analytical in the way of thinking. And of course, the generalization of the idea in that, I think the Sotgorod was the first one to put it like this is the way everywhere, that could be everywhere implied. Well, and the last question. No, I lost the last question. It was yes, it was the similarities or the relation of the party and etc. Yeah, I think that the role of the party was always very important because actually it was always the party which was the initiator of the project, and it was also the party who actually engaged the architects. So the initiative role of the party was like absolutely, I would say, everywhere in all of the cases. And what is perhaps not that clear for me is why in Vienna the formal way of organizing this social housing was so different than in those other examples. But perhaps it might be connected with Viennese history and with idea or with the history of collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and that there was a kind of feeling to look at the important historical inspirations when the building in Vienna or the development of Vienna was really flourishing, and it was like in this historical period. So perhaps this might be the reason why they choose the completely different inspirations and not the modern ones. It could be also connected with a strong position of Otto Wagner and his idea of town plan, which was somehow related with this Red Vienna, or the Red Vienna projects have been somehow related with Otto Wagner. And in Germany and in Czechoslovakia, it was much more, of course, related with avant-garde of 1920s, with this Neue Sachlichkeit, with the ideas of, let's say, we can go back to Heinrich Pessenau and his idea of a city in a greenery, very, very simple, with very simple buildings, totally loosened or totally not tied with the historical tradition of building. So the sources of inspirations are certainly not the same in Vienna and not the same in Germany and Czechoslovakia, but the connection between the German development and the Czechoslovak development is quite strong, even if it was not that much stressed in the discussion of that time, because, for example, the Czech discussion on architecture and social housing, which was much more oriented to Le Corbusier, and the French discussion, and perhaps the Belgian and the Netherlands discussion, and the Russian discussion, of course, and not that much on Germany. But in Slovakia, also because of this, let's say, individual preferences, for example, of the architect Friedrich Weinberg, who studied in Germany, who somehow developed his personal connections with Germany. So, and he was so influential, so he was able to switch the whole discussion in the direction on the German discussion. So I think it was always like, yes, party, but also the individual preferences of the particular architects and particular town planners. I don't know if I actually.
Okay, I can understand that party had its influence, but at the same time it was the individual. So there was some kind of liberty of architects, no?
Yes, definitely.
Okay, thank you.
Alright, we're back. Do we have anybody else, please? Let me check the microphones. We will see.
Speaking. Hi, I'm Corina Morandi, from Milano, and I was particularly interested in the focus about the Czechoslovakian case, and specifically about Bratislava. And I was wondering if you can add something about the localization of Nova Bratislava or Nova Nova, and then if we can find some criteria about localization, about accessibility, about the infrastructures of this very huge public housing settlements, and also in any case, which are the criteria for the choice of the site for this development. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, both of the projects been located on the periphery of the old town, behind let's say the main city circle, the main traffic circle, and actually it was not that revolutionary, the localization of the settlement, because it was in the intentions of the regulatory of the master plan of the town. So this land's been intended to new housing projects, but they in the regulation plan they have been planned in this traditional way, like a block structure. And the architects and the investors, they introduced this idea of row houses, which was not really at the beginning welcomed with some kind of enthusiasm. But again, because of this personal circumstances, they succeeded to perceive or to win for this idea also the city regulation committee. And they finally approved, okay, let's do this part of the city in this completely new way. Let's develop it in this modern town planning manner with 3 rows and without any blocks. So this was a kind of new step in town planning in general in Bratislava conditions. And actually, it was a kind of the very first development in that direction that was then continued even in 40s and 50s and 60s. This was the direction where the new housing estates grew after the Second World War as well. I don't know if I understood the question correctly. And
yes.
Regarding the infrastructure,
I was also thinking about the previous part, the first part of your lecture, and finding some of these main concepts of the utopian approaches, for example, about what we could call today regional equilibrium or polycentrism in some way. There are some of these ideas which belong to the planning regional issues. And then I was wondering if in cases that we have studied, most of all Nova Bratislava, but also, of course, the German case, Neue Frankfurt. If we can find, apart from the issues concerning the organization of the blocks, the issues concerning architecture and the organization of the neighborhood, some of the ideas about planning, which that we can, in any case, find in this history of the planning thinking left-oriented, let's say.
Yeah, definitely. I've been showing this example of the publication Unitas for the very first project of social housing in Bratislava, and they, in this publication, they really referred to Thomas More, for example. So the ambition was there to go back to the utopian socialist, or to this very beginning of utopian idealistic town, referring to it and literally writing that yes, we are building again a kind of utopian new world for our people or our cooperative. When you remember the cover of the it was actually the first slide in my presentation, this housing estate with the sun. All of the members of the cooperative being very influential members of the Freemason Lodge. So it was very much like going back to the history and talking about this tradition of utopian ideal town.
Thank you. All right, so we're now at the time. I think we are approximately 10 minutes behind, but I'm sure there will be enough time for the remaining questions after the second half of the lecture. The second half of the lecture will start at 12:30, but again, my advice would be to get back at least 5 minutes sooner for adjusting audio settings and everything. So for now, let's have a lunch break or a coffee break, and let's meet again in approximately 45 minutes. Thank you all for now. Okay. So, dear participants, to the webinar, we continue with the second part of the lecture. Alright, and I give the word to the professors.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Welcome back to our session. We finished our story with interwar period and developments and social housing in around the several European towns. I would like to make a short jump over the ocean to the United States and to the ideas of Frank Lloyd Wright, the very famous American modern architect. I would say one of the most influential architects of the 20th century in the United States. And as our idea is to talk about engagement of individuals in improving the society, perhaps Frank Lloyd Wright is not that much connected with this social idea, much more with the idea of luxury villas and ambitioned office buildings. But actually he was dealing with the idea of ideal organization of a city, connected a little bit with social engineering as well for several years, nearly 20 years. His idea of broad acre city was based on a similar thought as the garden city of Ebenezer Howard, and perhaps a little bit also referring to utopia. Broad acre city was a city of family cells. Each family actually should own, after land reform, 1 acre of ground, and it should be used for supply of wind resources for the whole family. So the 1 acre is just the sufficient amount of land to own to be like good in balance with also with supporting your family. This was actually something which could be now called as a vision of suburban development, which we have been facing during the whole 20s or the second half of the 20th century. At that time, in the beginning of 30s, when Wright came with this idea, of course it was welcomed with quite a lot of support or enthusiasm. What was already like, you can say that in common with other ideas, European ideas, for example, we can see here the maquette of the city. The idea of segregation of traffic, for cars and for pedestrians. The idea of living in a greenery. The idea of separating particular functions of the city, like industry, agriculture, culture, education, dwelling. But in the same time, it was not organized in a kind of lines or kind of zones, as we could have seen by Garnier or by Miliutin, but in frame of this very non-hierarchical grid structure of a megapolis or of a broad acre city, as Wright introduced it. This is only to add that it was not only a kind of European topic, but also United States or the architects in states contributed to this discussion. And of course, all these discussions have been somehow summarized or literally put together in the frame of the very famous Charter of Athens. That was actually put together in 1930s, but published only during the Second World War. And actually these ideas, as we can see it very, very, how to say, reduced and this on screen now, have been really tested in the reality, in the living world only after the Second World War. Not only because that the idea was really spread wide after Second World War, but also because that the economical situation, the industrial techniques and the building industry was after Second World War in such a condition that it was able to put this idea into reality. It was not the case, for example, in 30s, just because of the particular state of art at that time. So as you can see, this main chapters of the Charter of Athens, considering dueling recreation work, traffic, legacy of history. Actually, traffic, work, recreation, dwelling have been the main parts of the modern city, main functions that should have been operated by the new modern city. And the legacy of history was something relationship to history, what the modern architects or modern town planners should deal with. But as you can see already from this very short quotation, to deal with very selective and very future-oriented, not really history-oriented. All these ideas that have been considered like very, very progressive and very engaged in a way of improving the world, when putting in the reality in a very, very huge mass, they somehow turn out of its original intentions and have been hugely criticized because of their impact on the society and on the physical surroundings. Before that happened, I would like to go to this only few more quotations from the charter, which is not that important now, but perhaps we can go to some examples that used this background of Charter of Athens in practice, but not only that, but examples that already referred to some previous ideas, as for example the Sotsgorod and the linear city and the industrial city of Tony Garnier, and it happened just on the let's say in the period of Second World War. I would like to introduce the project, let's call it project, a social project of influential Czechoslovak industrialist Tomáš Baťa, who was producer of shoes. And actually his idea of industrial city was exactly something that tested the ideals or tested the principles introduced by Garnier, by Milutin, by a Charter of Athens in practice. The idea of Baťa was to establish new settlements according to the ideal plan of regulation plan of ideal industrial city called Baťa Satellite, and he regarding to the development of his company, of his enterprise, he established several of such satellites in different European and non-European countries, so we can say worldwide, following always the same principles, which are somehow put together on this example of regulatory plan for Baťovany, which was Baťa's settlement in the center of Slovakia. As you can see, the same principles as we already saw on the example of linear city by Milutin been implemented also here. Here we can see the area of industry, of the shoe factory, connected with the railway line and the main traffic line, car line, divided from the residential areas by greenery. Then followed the part of public services, public spaces, always in Baťa's settlements called Square of the Work or Square of the Labor, which is this part. The square was always surrounded by the most important public services like department store, municipality office, hotel, so-called Baťa School of Work, and connected with the second part of the central public space, which was also always public park. On both sides of this composition, there have been residential areas. On one side, residential areas with apartment houses. On the other side, residential areas with single-family houses. This is the so-called town planning frame of the ideas of Tomáš Baťa. But it was not only town planning behind his ideas of the ideal city or ideal society. It was also a kind of social engineering, because in his towns there was very strict how you should live in such a town. So how to use the public services, how to care about your own private family house, how to care about your small garden, how to what kind of sports you should make, what kind of activities should be of your interest. For example, in Baťa's satellites, there was prohibited to drink alcoholic drinks. Only soft drinks have been served, for example, in hotel or in the pubs. So this was really a kind of trial to develop the new society, supporting community life, community activities, and but at the same time supporting right family life.
Milano, ok, sono ok. E scrivere che no, ok, ha fatto era anche. Ok, sorry.
Okay. Which means you can hear us, right? You can hear us. Okay. So, sorry, please. All right. We are back.
Okay, I thought that this dramatic reaction was because of this alcoholic drinks prohibition idea. In Badia's way of thinking, architecture, town planning, social engineering, and the social condition of his satellites was very much connected. On this image, you can see how this idea was put in reality in Slovakia, in this Bratislava town, which was finished shortly after the Second World War. And what is perhaps interesting that how this idea was adopted by the communist regime after the turn of the regimes in 1948. When the Communist Party took the power in Czechoslovakia, and at the beginning the organization and the idea of the industrial town was very much in the line with the official politics. It changed only slowly, of course, because of the private ownership and the nationalization of the factory, etc. Here are some images from the beginning of the Baťovany settlement. As I already said, that the architecture and town planning was very much connected with the organization of the society. For example, all the women on the maternal leave, they've been like encouraged to spend the time together, to join the common facilities even before the children are in kindergarten, and then put them very soon in a kindergarten and to live this kind of community life, to start work very early back in the factory. Oops. Here's some images or some photographs of how the main square of labor looked like. In the middle you can see the social house, or so-called house of culture, with cinema and kind of restaurant and pub. Here other public buildings, so-called Bata School of Labor, which was a school for future workers in a shoe factory, to educate them in a manner of craftsmanship, but also in a way, in a social way. Because try to imagine that Bata always put his settlements in a land which was not urbanized before, and which was like where a great possibility of men's craft was available. So places with no other factories, no other possibilities for work. So he then could gather really young working crafts without any education and really of very poor conditions. And this was part of his strategy to invite such people who were then very fascinated by his idea, because for the first time they actually entered a kind of modern environment with modern architecture, with all these modern infrastructure and facilities like water line and hot water and water closet and electricity and all these like modern equipment. So the School of Labor was an institution where it was like a dormitory where you can study, but also learn how to live modern life. So how to make sports during your free time, how to live this life in community, how to live without that much influence of family, that much influence of church, and etc. So modern life. All the workers have been obliged to wear a kind of uniform that was part of the, we call it corporate identity of Baťa factories, but also of the whole system, that you felt from the very beginning like being part of this huge community of people working for Baťa. They even called them as Baťaist, or people working for Baťa, when you can translate it in English. Sport always organized in a mass dimension, collective sports, very supported, very much supported by the Baťa company, because they somehow could strengthen also the feeling of the community, of the whole settlement. Not only boys but girls as well. What was perhaps interesting from the architecture or town planning point of view, that for Baťa both have been interesting, or was interesting, collective housing in apartment houses, but also single family housing, because his idea was that after receiving a kind of milestone in your life, when creating a family and having children, then each person is should have his own small single family house. This was why he supported so much the building of such a minimal housing units. What was interesting, that the life in frame of this housing or this single family housing structures was very regulated. It was, for example, not allowed to brew animals there. You can have only your vegetable or fruit gardens, but no animals. You should have no fences, and so everything should be like connected, in a visual form, and even they established a kind of competition that the people, there was a special committee to look at the gardens, and to each of the family, they compete to have the best or the most beautiful garden in the town, and the local periodicals, they've been reporting about how the workers are dealing with their gardens, and who has the most beautiful potatoes and who has the most beautiful flowers, etc., etc. So it was very somehow community oriented, but also competition oriented. Why it was so? It was, of course, because Baťa was strongly influenced by United States. It was fascinated by Ford and Fordism. So it was a kind of combination of this very much Fordist, competitive, rational ideas with a kind of left-oriented social engineering. So very, very strange, I would say, social and architectural experiment. Here you can see on this image how the idea of the architectural form has changed in the turn of 30s and 40s. The houses with flat roofs are the first one from the 1930s, and already during the Second World War they started to build such a more traditionally homes with several roofs and small windows and some ornaments, because it was like more fitting to the general idea of comfortable family home. Actually, this social experiment and architectural experiment collapsed after several tens of years. but not that dramatically, because as I already put it, in 1948, after the nationalization in Czechoslovakia and after the Communist Party took the power in its hands, the development of such a satellites was still much in intention of the former Baťa ideas, because of this collective feeling and sharing of everything. But paradoxically, the dramatic collapse came only in 1990s, after privatization of the whole grounds in the satellites or in these settlements, when each owner of the particular one family house could develop it actually in its own, or in his or her own way. So you can see here on this image how Baťovany, or today called Partizanské, looks like after the individual authority took over the power and changed the former collective and community way of thinking about the settlement. So you can see fences, you can see additions, substructures over the original houses. Some of them are completely rebuilt in a new way. Some of them demolished and displaced by new structures. So the former idea of open by the community shared urban space is now dead. Perhaps you remember the guy named Jiří Kroha, Czech left avant-garde architect who was active in 1930s and who did actually the first scientific research on social condition of dwelling in Czechoslovakia, this sociological fragment of dwelling. After the Second World War, when already the Communist Party was on power in Czechoslovakia, Jiří Kroha was one of the main creators of the new architecture in sense of so-called socialist realism, which was artistic doctrine borrowed from Soviet Russia or from Soviet Union, idea based on the principle that working class should have its surroundings in the same manner or same style as it was intended in previous periods for bourgeois or for the ruling class. So not anonymous, abstract, cheap, modern housing, but housing based on historical examples, with ornaments, with yards, with these hierarchized structures where you can have a public, semi-public, and private spaces according to historical surroundings. He had the opportunity to design, one of the rare architects who had the opportunity to design a completely new town in 1951. It was on the territory of Slovakia, near the town of Dubnica nad Váhom. The name was Nová Dubnica, New Dubnica, so new town of Dubnica, satellite of the old town, which was based actually on these ideas of again, we can go back to the history and we would find some relations to, for example, the compositions of phalanx of this Fourier city of justice. When you look at this model of the city of Nová Dubnica, you can see the main axis, which was the main public space square with main public facilities leading to the cultural facilities and going to the nature, to auditorium, amphitheater, surrounded by the quite closed blocks of housing on each side, and slowly developing to more loosened structures on the periphery of the town. Everything, of course, surrounded by greenery, because the ideas of a charter of a temple have never been completely vanished, but somehow latent, present also in these kind of ideas. Here you can see some images from the beginning of the construction of this new town. As you can see already on the facade, it was really much inspired by the historical architecture in Czechoslovakia. It was the inspiration source was the period of Renaissance, and of course this is again somehow the connection with enlightenment and with utopia and all these ideas of ideal town and ideal society. Unfortunately, only a fragment of the town was finally constructed, but already on the fragment you can see the main principles, so the main public space with public facilities, and the courtyards with housing, and some facilities like schools and kindergarten in the center of the courtyards. What is interesting, this is how the estate or how the core of the town Nova Dubnica looks like now. What is interesting that how the people or the inhabitants, how they feel about their settlement or about this part of the town. And surprisingly, when we have made a kind of questionnaire about the feelings, the general response was that they absolutely not connect these forms and their living environment with the communist regime, even not if because the city was built actually in the most totalitarian era of the regime in 1950s, with very strict political pressure, but nobody actually connected his environment, living environment nowadays with his political background of that time. On the contrary, they perceive it as a very comfortable, very human surroundings, or a very good place for life. Nova Dubnica, the new Dubnica, was not only one settlement or only one estate organized in the same way. We have other examples, not that much in Slovakia. In the Czech part of the country, it was much more developed, or much more development have been realized, for example, in the industrial towns like Ostrava and etc. But this one is another quite compact project that was realized as a whole. It is in Bratislava, and perhaps if you remember the example of Red Vienna, how the Karl Marx Hof and all the others hofs, or in English courtyards, have been organized, so you can see a kind of common features. Red Vienna and these Bratislava settlements from the 1950s. Inspiration by historical architectural forms, inspiration by layouts of classical palaces, or layouts of let's say these Enlightenment thinkers like Fourier. This, I would say, this kind of very short period of looking back to the history and by history inspired developments in 1950s changed very fast to a completely new, modern, let's say, again modern thinking about the development of cities, about development of housing in frame of the cities. And it was because of the invention of new technologies of new building constructions, new building industries, much more influenced by prefabrication and again, of course, typification and unification. But prefabrication became a kind of moving tool or most important tool for the housing projects of the second half of the 20th century, not only in Czechoslovakia or Slovakia, but in the whole, at least in the whole Europe. Here on example, you can see actually the first prefabricated housing block that was built in Bratislava, and what is perhaps interesting that architect who stood behind this idea was Vladimir Karfík. Vladimir Karfík used to be one of the chiefs of the architecture office of the Baťa company, and that was exactly the place where he learned to work with prefabrication and typification, because Baťa's company was very much involved in developing prefabricated building elements. But what might be also interesting, that Karfík actually gained his architectural skills by Frank Lloyd Wright in the United States. He was working in his team in Taliesin 1, so he was really very good schooled for let's say, modern industrialized architecture, and he proved it on this example of the very first prefab. This is the cover of the one of the issues of architecture periodical that was published in Slovakia from 1950s actually till today. The main architectural review called Project, and of course all devoted to the idea of prefabrication and how the prefabrication will influence the architecture and of course the city development as well. On this image of Bratislava from 1960s, I would like to show how these particular ideas of architecture and of town planning influence actually the form of the city landscape. When we look at the image somewhere here in the corner, we can feel that this was the core of the old city, or the periphery of the old town, surrounded by the developments from 1930s. These are some of the, not the first, but some of the very first social housing in Bratislava. And just behind these quite compact and quite modern housing estate, you can see these new developments from 1950s, very much historical form, going back to this palaces layout. And then just a few years later, you can already see housing estates from the late 1950s, very loosened structure in the greenery, with high-rise buildings, more in the way how Le Corbusier thought about modern town planning, and continuing about to develop in the biggest actually housing estates of 60s and 70s, where the idea of the green city and the idea of the Corbusier Cité Radieuse was really developed to enormous dimensions. So the structure of the city was really somehow, or still is reflecting very much the change of the ideas, the change of the paradigms in frame of the urban thinking, or thinking about the town planning. What does this has to do with our idea of engaged architecture? I would say we are still talking about the same engagement. It started somehow in the 1920s when the European architects tried to solve the big problem with the lack of flats, and only after the Second World War those ideas really spread that much in that amount or in that dimension that nearly in each European country this big housing estates, mostly prefabricated housing estate, could be developed in a frame of the ideas of Charter of Athens, so actually in frame of the ideas of the big emancipation story of modernism when we're talking about city planning and architecture. These are just some of the housing estates that have been realized in Bratislava, which is now capital of Slovakia, and which was very much developed, the city of Bratislava in the first years after the Second World War, somehow to strengthen the position of the town as a Slovak metropole in frame of Czechoslovakia. So there is probably no other, not probably, but there is no other town in the former Czechoslovakia with such a great amount of modern housing estates as Bratislava is. You will see on the next images that actually the most part of the land that belongs to the town is occupied by modern housing estates. These are some of the very first examples, very ambitious from the architectural and town planning point of view, as you can see, with very interesting features of public facilities and the combination of quite ambitious high-rise apartment houses and some blocks. Again, I put some quotations from the Charter of Athens because, for example, if you look at this example of perspective drawn by Slovak architects for a housing estate, Ružinov, it was completely in intentions that have been put down in the conclusion of the Charter of Athens. And because of the communist regime and of the nationalization and of the state ownership of land, it was possible to realize all these ideas, also to put it in practice. That was perhaps not that much possible in countries with capitalist economies. Here you can see what I have already put. What does it mean to have the most of the city structure covered by a modern housing estate? This is Bratislava in its borders. This is the historical core of the city, like medieval core of the city. Here the city center from the first part of the 20th century, and all these are the modern settlements built after 1960. So really amazing structure and really the in comparison in European situation, I mean it's quite unique situation. This is just a reference of a book we have been we published on this topic a few years ago. But going back to some examples, the one that was already illustrated by the nice perspective view is this housing estate of Ružinov, which was really a kind of exemplary solution in intention of the Charter of Athens, so really engaged project to introduce in Bratislava surroundings completely new ideas of living in a free green landscape with nice air and sun, all the recreation possibilities. You can see these are small lakes surrounded by the residential blocks. This is actually the main axis of the housing estate, with some important public facilities like shopping centers, but more like department stores, schools, center of culture, some offices, and the small units of residential buildings, small, let's say, semi-open yards with some high-rise, some low-rise apartment buildings with small medical centers, kindergartens, and schools. Actually, this kind of unit was called in Eastern debate mikrorayon, which is a term coming from a Soviet discussion. In Slovak, we called it okrsok, which is a kind of like a small quarter of I don't know how to put it in English. Here are some images how it looked like shortly after the housing estate was constructed. So you see the residential, of course, prefabricated housing blocks and public facilities. This is kindergarten and school. Always this was a kind of, let's say, experimental development in particular typologies the architect has been dealing with the goal how to design a perfect modern kindergarten, how to design which could be like type that will be used in each of the settlements, how to design a perfect elementary school that could be used in all the other settlements in the future. So this was a kind of beginning of the typification in a field of several typologies. And this is how the housing estate looks now, when the greenery really grew in a big mess, and actually the story is very similar to the story of Nova Dunica, that the people are generally quite satisfied with the surroundings and with the living conditions in these, let's say, built utopias. But it was not always like that, because when I switch a little bit oh yes, because it was not always like that, because when the amount of housing estates really grew in such a massive way in the late 1970s, already the social criticism that originated at that time was really critical, and because most of the facilities have not been finished or accomplished in that way that they have been planned. So it was very poor constructed, with most of the planned public facilities have never been realized. So all the housing estates faced really big social problems, and this criticism, this collapse actually of this social idea, of this utopia, was one of the reasons why actually the whole system of communist rule finally collapsed, because this was something that touched everybody. It was connected with everybody's life, the conditions on this unfinished modern housing projects. I would just like to go a little bit back. This was the case of, I wanted to show you one of the last big projects of this utopian idea of modern housing estate, called Petržalka, which is the biggest housing estate in the whole Europe, housing 150 dozens of inhabitants. It was really a kind of utopian, big idea to build a new satellite for Bratislava on the other bank of the Danube River, with a very big competition, international competition at the beginning. Architects from all over the world and town planners from all over the world took part in this competition in 1967. Architects from United States, Japan, France, Great Britain, and I don't know, all other countries. And they proposed actually ideas that already announced that let's say, the utopian big emancipated story is not that much in the focus of their thinking or their planning. It was more about the form, more about the, let's say, architectural or town planning ambitions, and not that much about social thinking. And perhaps this was also one of the reasons why this, or one of the examples how the modern story, or how the emancipated or emancipation story behind the modern projects was somehow slowly disappearing. This is how the housing estate finally was built. So no experiments in formal or layout design, but very, very strict, very rational, and very, how to say, set, finally, very set settings, finally, that provoke many criticism, as you can see here, because this is exactly the example of the Okay, with this big or with this collapse of big town planning ideas regarding the Charter of Athens, or in terms of Charter of Athens, I would like to somehow conclude the history, or the looking back in our today's session. Of course, with a very, I would say, sophisticated remark by the German author who actually put it very, very literally, what he thinks about the modern project. But I would like to somehow draw your attention, or turn your attention to some examples that are connected also with today's development, but somehow have their roots in a history, or at least in second half of the 20th century. Because if we are talking about the modern project, about its collapse, or about its potential to continue, we cannot escape the debate, for example, the radical pedagogies of Italy in 1960s. We cannot escape the discussion on plug-in city, or other discussions connected with the criticism of modernism in 1960s and 1970s. I choose this one project done by people who later created the famous Office of Metropolitan Architecture, OMA, with the guru Rem Koolhaas. This was actually their idea about, let's say, another interpretation of linear city connected with London, when they proposed a stripe or a linear of separated living environment in the middle, or crossing the old structure of London, and in frame of this linear city, a completely new society should be introduced with different values, different living conditions, different status, as it would be in the surroundings of the old London. And of course, we cannot, when we are talking about architecture engagée, about engaged architects, we cannot go by behind or leave out of our discussion Alejandro Aravena, who is a very famous Chilean architect, thinking or engaging himself in social housing, developing completely new, let's say new, but by the history inspired solutions for improving life working class or people without resources. Perhaps we can go back to the last architecture biennale in 2016, where he was the main curator, and many of the exhibited projects somehow dealt with the idea of the engagement of architects in the, let's say, process of improving the society. Here some of his projects or projects of his office, Elemental. Actually, what is his idea? His idea is to give these people without resources a very basic frame, very cheap frame of dwelling, a kind of construction, and they can add their homes, or they can construct their own homes on their own with their own resources, with their own craftsmen, like as they know, as they are able to do. So it's like it's only frame that will be developed by the inhabitants on their own. Very cheap, actually, way how to do it. Actually, also interesting from the town planning point of view, because it's always built on a kind of periphery that was perhaps before a kind of favelas, because he's of course dealing with the South America surroundings. Just giving a kind of new order, or just a frame to create a new order, not very, how to say, not that much in a way of social engineering as it was in the beginning of 1920s or in 1930s, but more counting with the individual choice of the people who are going to live in these houses. So just a frame, and let the people organize their lives how they will. Another completely different idea of engagement, or how the architects today could still engage themselves in improving the life of the society, is the project of urban interventions, which is, I don't know if we have still the time, we can switch to the but very shortly to the web page, because it's quite unique that this is a group of Slovak architects, Matúš Valo and Oliver Sadovský, who created a kind of network of young architects who invest their private time to improve critical places in a city. It started in Bratislava, but then it was like spread in many other towns, not only in Slovakia but in Czech Republic and other countries. And the idea is actually that you do it for free. You find a problem on your own and you propose a solution of this problem, and you put it like an idea to the municipality, or the municipality can invest then to realize the improvement, or you invent the solution and you invest your own working craft to improve something. So you just organize a group of people and you do it on your own. So it's very much like about activism and about the active society, active public, that it's really in the hand of the public to change their life. This was, for example, an idea about a couple of young architects. This is Bratislava, the Danube River, with a very, how to say, pasted area of riverbanks, and they propose a kind of interventions how to improve the riverbanks, and what kind of functions and what very cheap solutions could be done to improve this part of the city. Another example we can find here in Košice, and I would really like to stress it and perhaps to finish with this, because as all know, we in Slovakia have a quite huge problem with Roma population, with very poor conditions they live in. And I must say that there are quite a lot of students of our Faculty of Architecture of Bratislava or the Faculty of Arts here in Košice, who are trying to improve this situation in very many ways, with some activist work, with some workshops, like when they are trying to educate the population of such a, let's say, Roma slums, how to improve their situation, their dwelling situation. And one of the last of such projects was organized last year. It was a town planning and architecture competition on quite problematic housing estate in Košice called Luník 9. This is how it was, the housing estate shortly after its construction. Now it is much more devastated. But before most of the solutions being done, like, yeah, okay, let's improve the building structure, and it's all. But what is the most, I would say, most interesting result of this competition is that the people, the young architects, because they are really very shortly, these winning entries, they are really very shortly after their graduation, they understand that it is not only important to improve the environment, but to educate the people and to give them the tools how to improve the environment themselves. So again, it is very much about the engaged role of the architect, because he knows what is necessary to do, how to teach the people what they can do. So it's not only about designing new one-family houses or designing new apartment blocks. It is about organizing the space. It is about giving them working possibilities. So the winning entry, they introduced the idea of a small factory that where the local people will elaborate a building material of which they will then construct their own dwelling. So it's really a kind of, again, utopian, very engaged project, which I hope will really improve, or yes, that has not only the ambition, but I hope that it really will improve the situation in this small community. And this is, I would like to finish with this, perhaps only to summarize what we have been talking about, some more links that might be interesting for you, because I was not talking about the initiative, for example, of Italian architect and town planner Vittorio Aureli, who is developing research and projects on a contemporary city. Also, we can call it a little bit utopian, or he's working with some ideas of some utopian ideas of the European architecture and town planning history. Or, for example, we've been talking about the Frankfurter kitchen and about the house commune, so we can mention Anna Hügiacher, her project Kitchenless City is very popular now. Her idea to develop dwelling with minimal living cells without kitchen, when all the works connected with the household are outsourced. Very similar, like it was done or sold about in house commune. So you see that all the ideas, like from Moore through the Soviet avant-garde and all the European avant-garde, they are again coming back and they are again discussed and rethink. And I would say that Habermas is quite right with his idea about the modernity as unfinished project, and that there is still potential, let's say, at least in the way of engagement of architects and town planners in improving the society. So thank you for your attention, and if there are some questions, we can, if Katarina will help me with this, we can continue.
Thank you. Just return to the audience now. So thank you for the second part of the lecture as well. Again, if there are some questions, we have approximately 15 to 20 minutes. So first of all, maybe I give some space to the audience here in Košice. Whether anyone would like to ask anything? If not, of course...
Maybe I have a question.
All right, thank you. But I would like to ask you to come here so that everybody can hear.
I had a question about example of Bata. If some other industries in Czechoslovakia or even elsewhere did the same project like Utopia with rules for inhabitants and so on, or it's really unique.
I think it's quite unique. Perhaps I'm wrong, but I think that this is really unique, and it happened actually. It started in Zlín in Czechoslovakia and was spread out in France, in Great Britain, in South America, in India. So I think he was quite ambitious, but I don't think so that in such an amount that it happened somewhere else. Perhaps I'm wrong, and some of our people who are joining our session will correct me, but I don't know about it.
Okay, and do you think that the communist state then was inspired by them, or they did the same but not? It's not linked.
I don't think that it was very much like that they've been inspired, because it was always connected with this Fordism and all these American ideas of, let's say, capitalist production. So it was not really the inspiration. But on the other hand, what he created, this kind of involvement of workers in the let's say, production process, it was something really inspirative. And I would say that in the very beginning of the communist rule, like in the 50s, that even in those former Bata settlements, you can feel it or observe it, that they used or misused this community and communal feeling of the people and the engagement. Later it was, of course, because it was a political question. First they leave all the people, like also the important leaders in the factory, for example, the chiefs, remain the same because they were very good in their jobs. But then, due to political circumstances, they were somehow put away, and that was the end of the continuity, because nobody was then able to be that much involved and without this tradition, so slowly it disappeared. But it was quite present for let's say, 2,000 or 3,000 years, so quite long.
Thank you.
But perhaps Olivetti in Italy. Olivetti in Italy, actually, Ivrea, he created quite, perhaps my colleagues correct me, but actually it was quite similar, organized, the settlement and the equipment for the people, perhaps not that much with this social, that it was not so strict in this social organization, but the settings, it was quite similar.
All right. Some other participants, questions? Last time you turned your microphones on your own, so please feel free to do the same now. If you would like to ask anything or to add anything.
Can I add? Hello.
Okay, it's Elvira. All right, thank you, Elvira.
I have just one little question about Bata settlement. So it's really interesting, yes, his initiative to create the city, but I just wanted to know your opinion. How do you think, was it just industrial settlement? I mean, the motives of Bata to create this city, was it just oriented as industrial settlement that create industry and make people dependent of them, of this industry, and or was it just was it maybe his initiative to change the society? I don't know what his position was in this question, in the influence.
Yeah, I would say that his motivation was definitely economical. That his intention was purely industry production, but perhaps as unintentionally, he actually changed the society, and especially in the regions where the population was really in the very rural regions, like it was in Slovakia. Baťa settlements really completely changed the local societies because they modernized the way of life. So the impact of Baťa settlements, for example, in Slovakia, was really social-like. And for example, of course, it was not only positive, it was very much criticized that he actually initiated the young people to left their rural conditions and to move to the Baťa settlements. So they completely refused on the tradition, they refused on the family life, and they just switched to a modern life, like modern singles in this modern industrial town. So it has really a big impact. There are several novels in Slovak literature writing about talking about the destiny of individual who left his rural conditions in a nice village and went to work for Baťa and faced these very strict modern Fordist conditions and was completely lost and deprivated and whatever, and then you can find another story that is talking about just opposite, how the people who were starving without jobs and without anything, they get the opportunity to work for Baťa and their lives completely changed. They became members of this Baťa school of work with new uniform, with a nice life, and finally with a good family and a wonderful single family house in the settlement. So the destinies have been completely different, but the impact of Baťa on the Slovak society was really a huge one, but not with intention, I would say.
Okay, thank you, Elvira. Okay, I'm just checking whether anybody else has turned off the... Okay.
Can I ask?
All right, please. So it's Xenia.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I have just one brief question. We saw briefly in one of your slides about the interventions in Bratislava on the Danube River. So I'm curious about this project and who were the actors and in which extent was it the project of the engaged architecture?
We can go, perhaps we can go back to
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, let's go back.
I think they don't see.
They don't see.
They don't see, but...
okay, no.
Okay, we'll share it again.
Oh, perhaps we can... Yes, this is even better.
This?
Yes.
Our presentation.
Yes, this is even better. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, so we can go back to these ideas. Yes, this is yes. I just want to show it on the yes. Yes, it was called Costa Bratislava, and then the idea was actually to. It was not really. Of course, it was a kind of engaged project because they somehow wanted to animate the local authorities to invest money in improvement of the land and to improve it in a way to make it not kind of exclusive spaces for gaining more money, but very inclusive spaces for all without necessarily paying something to join the riverbanks. So this was, in this way, it was very social oriented. And the people, this is the couple, Lubica Segičova and Martin Jančok, and she's a graphical designer, he is architect, and 00 is architecture office located in Prešov, in different part of Slovakia. And at that time they joined common, let's say, office, design Nakoles, that was the name. But unfortunately, nothing of their ideas have been ever realized. It remained only as a impulse, but without any concrete development, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you so much.
Perhaps if you are interested in it, you can browse the webpage and you can see their argumentation of them and also other projects that some of them also developed to kind of realization.
Okay, surely I will. With Costa Bratislava is the name, right?
Okay, Costa Bratislava.
Yes, okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ksenia. Okay, please feel free to ask. We have some more minutes left. Alexander? Yes? Alexander? So Alexander is an early stage researcher from Bauhaus University Weimar. So,
hello, thank you very much for such a great presentation. I'm wondering, maybe can you elaborate a bit more on, can you hear me?
yes, please.
Yeah, okay, good. Can you elaborate a bit more about the resources that you use for your presentation and that's used more for the history of urbanism and architecture in 20th century today in Slovakia?
Okay.
The second question too.
Okay, resources. Well, as I at the beginning, as I put it, the idea actually to look at the history of European urbanism or architecture from the perspective of architecture engagée was taken from Winfried Nerdinger, and this is his book. So perhaps if you like to, it's quite huge. So there's really, I would say, it's much of the European urban history that is somehow connected with the topic we've been talking about today. You can find here. Nothing about Slovakia, unfortunately, or quite typical. So if you are interested in Slovakia, I would advise then perhaps the one book I mentioned during my presentation, which is the Atlas of Mass Housing in Bratislava. It is kind of concise history of social housing on the territory of Bratislava. Then again on perhaps in the general like Czechoslovak settings, there is Kimberly Ellman and her book on socialist manufacturing the socialist reality. Then nowadays there is a new, when you are interested in post-war, then perhaps I can switch to pre-war, but post-war, nowadays 2 volumes of a book on Czech prefabricated housing came out, edited by Rostislav Švacha, and I don't know what the name, it's Paneláci or something like this, I'm not sure. But it's brand new, like 1 month ago it was published, and recently there is an exhibition connected with this publication in Prague in the National Gallery, so perhaps you can browse a little bit and you will find it. Regarding the older history, or perhaps the situation under authoritarian regimes, there is in the Central Europe or Czechoslovakia, there was a project called Atrium, which is actually partner of your consortium, and there have been some books published, including our book with the name Modern or Totalitarian in Slovak Architecture in 20th Century. is more about 40s, 50s, 60s, and so on. And the beginning of 20th century, most of the literature, unfortunately, in Slovak or Czech, but there are some books in English as well. About, for example, the architect Friedrich Weinwurm that I'm talking about, there is a huge monograph, actually, that I have written, 2014, architect Friedrich Weinwurm is the name of the monograph in English. And what else we can do? Perhaps if it might be interesting also for others, we can put together a kind of bibliography list, and then we can email it or put it somewhere on the web. Or regarding also the common European history, perhaps this quite ambitious project done by Ákos Moravanský at ETH. But I cannot remember the name of the series. It was 3 volumes or 4 volumes on European architecture history, like West and East, with essays by his PhD students. I would say this is the last done by Ákos Moravanský, so it's quite easy to find it.
I think Alexander, you had another question?
Yeah, the second question is, I'm wondering if you can, what's your idea about the perception of the urbanism as history of 20th century and how it's changed maybe the last 20, 15 years? The perception of urbanism, 20th century urbanism history, how it's changed in Slovakia, maybe in Czech Republic, in the last 15, 20 years?
I would say, if I understood it correct, you are asking about how the history of urbanism is somehow discussed and understood in the last years, am I right?
Yes.
Okay. So I would say nobody was really dealing with urban history, let's say, 5 or 10 years ago. It was not really in the focus of interest of the architecture historians. And even today, I must say that my colleagues on the Department of Town Planning, for example, at the Faculty of Architecture, they are really not working with the urban history. They are not that much. They are not interested in urban history, and it was also not part of the teaching lessons or of the program in frame of the architecture history. So I would say that during the last 10 years we are starting to discover really and starting to understand the history of urbanism in Europe. So this is actually the right time, and I would say that the reason for this development is that after the Second World War, or in the last 10 years of 20th century, we've been still living the history of urbanism, and now we are this is the first time when we are able to look back, that it's again a kind of crisis in frame of the town planning in Europe. We can feel it quite intense. So this is the reason why we are again looking back and why we are discussing actually these topics. So I think that at least in our countries here around, this is really for the first time that we are seriously looking at the modern town planning history or modern history of urbanism in Europe. Perhaps I'm wrong, but I think in a broader way, of course there have been particular studies on particular problems, but in general I would say that this is for the first time. And of course we are not that much critical about, let's say, development, post-war development that we used to be in the end of 20th century, but now we are able to look at these things with more more respect, if I can call it.
Or objectivity, maybe.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alexander. Alright, so we have space for maybe one more last question. If anyone would like to ask anything, if not, I would like to thank, of course, to our guest speaker, Professor Moravčíková, and also to all of you participants. I hope that the streaming was good. I hope that you were able to listen to us. We would very much like to receive your feedback as well, so please feel free to get back to me through email, and we must learn from this because we have some more webinars to organize, so please, if anything did not work or you could not see, could not hear, etc., just let us know. So at the end, once again, a big thank you to Professor.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and that will be all from us. See you sometime in the future, probably in April. in Spain. So, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.